My name is Turki Shiksal. I teach in the political science department here at Columbia. I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel, which is co-sponsored by the Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Maison Française, and the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. We're here to discuss and also celebrate the appearance of Transparency in Postwar France, a critical history of the present, by Professor Stefanos Virilanos, who's an associate professor of European intellectual history at New York University and the director of the Center for International Research in Humanities and Social Sciences, a research collaborative between the CNRS and NYU. The book, before I introduce the book, I want to introduce its illustrious author. Although it came out in 2017, it's not even his most recent book. He's a truly prolific scholar and an author whose work spans really an amazing expanse of historiography and the philosophy of science, epistemology, cultural studies, to name a few. So he is most recently the author with Todd Myers of The Human Body in the Age of Catastrophe, Riddleness, Integration, Science, and the Great War, out from the University of Chicago Press in 2018. I have to say, when I saw that title after the release of that one, I was like, oh, now we need to do another book. So watch the space. He is the sole author of An Atheism That Is Not Humanist Emerges in French Thought, which is also from the Stanford University Press Cultural Memory in the Present series from 2010. He's the co-editor of a volume entitled The Scaffolding of Sovereignty, Global and Aesthetic Perspectives on the History of a Concept, which is out from Columbia University Press in 2017. See, we're only down to 2017 in our chronology. He has a co-authored book in German on the philosophy of Kurt Goldstein's holistic theory of the organism, and he's a translator of two books by the French philosopher of science, Georges Canguilhem. I won't say much about the book since we have two distinguished commentators whom I'm yet to introduce. But when I saw the news of its publication, I thought it was really important to mark the appearance of what, after having read it, I know to be a towering piece of scholarship with really an astonishing range. In the course of tracing the reception and the transformations of this pivotal notion of transparency, Virilanos offers us an impossibly rich and detailed account of French intellectual life in the post-war period, and also establishes, I think, an impossibly high standard of how to do conceptual history, an endeavor that's all too easy to reduce to a one-dimensional kind of plodding narrative form. I should know because I'm a political theorist. So without saying very much on the book, I want to introduce our commentators of the evening who are here to help us appreciate Virilanos' masterful achievement. Ayten Gündoğdu, to my right, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. Her research spans topics of migration, sovereignty, human rights, and personhood. She is the author of an acclaimed book entitled Rightlessness in an Age of Rights, which came out of Oxford University Press in 2015. It examines the struggles of refugees and asylum seekers through the timeless political philosophy of Hannah Arendt. Gündoğdu is the recipient of numerous accolades, including a fellowship at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University and a Mellon Fellowship at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale University, where she's currently based. So she has come out of her sabbatical for the exceptional occasion of commenting on Professor Virilanos' book. And to my far left, no political affiliation implied, is Thomas Dogman, who is an assistant professor of French at Columbia University and an expert on modern French history and the history of France's empire. His most recent book, What Nostalgia Was, War, Empire, and the Time of a Deadly Emotion, was published by Chicago University Press in 2017. He's currently working on a new book project entitled When Emile Went to War, which examines the family romance of a French Revolutionary era citizen soldier. Among other accolades, he has served as a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in 2016 and 2017, and he received grants from the Library of Congress and the Marie Curie program. So the format that I've proposed to our panelists is for Stefanos to spend about 15 minutes introducing the book to the audience, and then for each of the commentators to speak for about 10 minutes, after which we'll open it up to questions and comments from the audience. So Stefanos, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was way too generous and way too kind. The entire event is very moving for me, so thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for preparing to speak on this. Thank you also to Shani for the organization. So thank you also to Shani and Alex for the organization, and to the Him Center and the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, of which I've forgotten the seat. Sure what that is. So this book began a little bit after a peak in the understanding of transparency, which dates to 2009. It wasn't intentional, I didn't have any idea of it at the time. But in his first day in office, Barack Obama, as president, wrote a memo where he lectured government agencies about how good it is to be transparent. And the memo said, government should be transparent. Transparency promotes accountability and provides information for citizens about what their government is doing. And he went on for a little while. And at that point, it seemed as though on the one hand transparency, or I suppose now I think that at that point, it seemed as though transparency was not only a good thing, but also a very good moment of cure after the 8 years of the Bush administration, so that suddenly a government could know what, citizens could know what their government is doing, could treat it as responsive, could demand that it be responsive, rather than responding to wars fought on false premises or to a financial crisis that was based on near inscrutable financial products. And that was the first thing that in retrospect was significant. At the same time, there were multiple peaks that would happen one after the other. The first one was a new respect for whistleblowing. It's not as though this hadn't been present before, but we were and continued to speak of whistleblowers from the 2009 through 2011, 2012 period. David Cameron in government pronounced that transparent government was his utter priority, and he declared in 2010 that transparency held public officials accountable, enabled innovation, and most magically it also reduced the national debt. So now, from there on, by 2011, there was a new open government partnership, which is by now, to which 75 countries have signed on to by now, which is kind of surprising. They have all sorts of metrics as to what constitutes transparent government and what is not simply not corrupt, but an appropriate government to work with. So, in a way, that was one first course for a peak. And things have become quite different by now, not necessarily away from transparency, but quite different. And it seemed to me, once I had started writing about this, that it may be worth it to actually engage with this in some detail. But I'll pause at this point and go back to the post-war moment into France by way of a little bit of an introduction to the book. What was peculiar about the French post-war period is that transparency was not a positive value. And this marks the French apart from not only most of the other countries of the Western Bloc, but also after a point from the Soviet states as well. So we can compare, for example, to the post-war US with intellectual claims both for sincerity, for example, at the individual level, and open government and open society, for example, the famous Karl Popper book on the open society, and then the practices from the 60s around the Freedom of Information Act, the demand for a government that's not merely responsive but open and not hiding all sorts of things that happen in Vietnam, and gradually a government that would be, in one case, a government that would be felled by secret operations, namely around Watergate. In Germany, too, the post-war period was associated with a certain transparency. That is to say, the beginning of glass architecture in Germany was associated with a sense of openness and democratic responsibility. And the towering version of this, of course, is the dome of the refurbished Reichstag in Berlin, which is also made of glass explicitly in order to promote this democratic openness. In the Soviet Union, glasnost began as a critical ideal, speaking of openness, and again by the 1980s it had been co-opted by the Soviet government itself. So, by comparison, in France, transparency is routinely marked in the post-war period as an illusion. It's marked as something entirely untrustworthy. It's marked as a term that promises things that not only cannot be offered, but generally could be associated with stupidity. So, for example, one would not refer to someone being transparent as somebody being honest, which is something that would be fairly typical in English, but one would refer to someone who is see-through as being transparent. And that indicates a much broader set of concerns and priorities that seem on the one hand minimal, and on the other hand, twist things around quite significantly. So by the 1960s, so this really seems to me to begin in the late 1930s and again to reappear in the 1940s, and by the mid-60s, transparency had been resolutely relegated to the Enlightenment and at the same time was being re-engaged as something of a false or illusory idea. The premise of the book is that transparency is one of these sort of minor or phantom-like concepts, terms that people don't really negotiate in great detail. I mean, they do now, let's say, but terms that were not necessarily used or negotiated in great detail, but that was thus indicative and symptomatic of bigger shifts and that spoke back to them. So things like shifts on the way that difference is understood, or on norms, on the legacy of the Enlightenment, or of the complexity of modernity, of the status of contemporary democratic thinking, and the possibility of one or other alternative to the way that politics is working. Additionally, the French seem to have more of a demand that government have effect, and thus that policy have effect, rather than that government be altogether and always clear about what it is that it's doing. Usually when a government was described as operating in the light of day, or as given metaphors of the sun or of utter clarity, this was not intended to suggest that a government was being good, but rather that a government was trying to pry open one or other side of society. So there were four basic angles that I tracked through the book, and none of them sort of operate on its own, because this is the trickiness of the concept itself, but they operate quite interestingly together. The first one is that there is an ethical concern around transparency. The second is that there's a concern about knowledge, and transparency concerns not simply my relations to another person, which would be the principally ethical one, but my understanding of the world and the way that the world relates to it. So that if ethicists were concerned about the other to begin with, in epistemology people began with an assumption that the belief that we could describe the world perfectly had to be altogether abandoned, and this intellectualist, positivist, idealist format had to be left aside, so that people would look instead at various obstacles that would arise when you thought that you knew where you were going. A third, broader concern with transparency concerned selfhood. And thus the idea, very simply put through psychoanalytic thinking, that the self is not transparent to itself. And the work of Lacan is perhaps the most explicit in this engagement of trying to figure out as many possible separations and obstacles within the self, so that one would not be a priori assuming that you can actually trust something that is spoken by the subject that speaks. And the fourth version came in politics. So to give a slightly longer account of this, and to track through what I do in the book, I'm going to say 2 words about ethics and another couple of words about politics. In the case of ethics, in the 1930s, we really face a priority among intellectuals of a Catholic community or a communist utopia. Even among fascist intellectuals, there is a substantial commitment to certain ideals, if not of communion, of at least proximity and participation, even of a kind of rapturous relationship with others. And this is largely abandoned after the war. Existentialism would be the most obvious point of reference, whereby one would neither trust the subject to do what she or he is supposed to do, nor abandon the subjectivity altogether. Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity is perhaps the most clear expression of this, in which there cannot possibly be any given ethics that would simply clear up the issue itself. Sartre's accusation of bad faith as not only political but an ethical concern also participates in this. And then by the 1960s, we have 2 famous directions, or 2 now famous directions in French thought, one of which concerns otherness in a phenomenological manner, and that would be Emmanuel Levinas's sense that the other is utterly other to me, and that any sort of undoing of that otherness is immediately a violent imposition of myself onto this other. And the second version would be perhaps Claude Lévi-Strauss's and other anthropologists concerned with the otherness of the indigenous subject, or the otherness of somebody who is to be engaged. And that's, for example, the description that Lévi-Strauss offers in his famous Christopique of the complete difference between him and the Nambiquara, a difference that he can only cross by, how should I put it, by identifying with them, by identifying with the least and most distant of others, one that he can only do in undoing his entire personal history. This is an elaborate drama in the text. His entire personal history and his entire ethical and political involvement vis-a-vis those closest to him. Like the Levinas case, the Lévi-Straussian anthropologist would become something of an extraordinary, fantastical ideal of refusing this immediate transparency, because this transparency would mean homogenization of the other, reduction of the other to what I already know about him, and then would continue in this manner as a call to imagine the world differently. Around 1968, this is radicalized, or especially after 68, this idea about the other is radicalized, as are ideas about norms and normality that then lead in part to anti-psychiatry, or that lead in part to rethinking of a gender difference. In the political side of things, there's again a concern with ambiguity, and there's a broad attack in the 1940s that I find supremely interesting toward the philosophers that had come before. That is to say, toward liberal thinkers or Third Republic mandarins who had imagined, as Merleau-Ponty says, that the world is, as Merleau-Ponty claims, that the world was a world full of statues, not of real people, but simply of statues. And thus, various types of debates around alienation begin to multiply in the late 1940s and to become all the more pressing, both in anti-state politics in the 60s and 70s, in one direction, and in the other direction toward a radicalism of mistrusting, so to speak, any possible political solution that would be all too straightforward, any possible consensus scenario or any scenario that would allow for a socialist or even a socialist politics to take hold. Only in the 70s does that change, but there too things were a little bit more complicated. Claude Lefebvre, for example, famously enthroned as France's democratic theorist and produced as a kind of parallel to Rawls in the US, or to presented as a parallel to Rawls in the US or to Habermas in Germany, unlike Rawls and Habermas, had a positive terror of transparency. In text after text after text, he describes the self-transparency of society to be a totalitarian ideal. And the term is used, especially in the 1970s, systematically to consider and reject the possibility that society would ever be at one with itself. Instead, it is this sort of caesura or kind of lacuna that would be necessary for any society to produce an empty space and democratic argument. And his students, some of whom write to this day, would follow up with this kind of argument. Pierre-Jean Vallon, for example, may have largely abandoned this political position in the 80s and 90s, as most socialists actually would as well. But in the late 1970s, he began his book on utopian capitalism with a detailed attack on transparency as a bad communist and totalitarian fantasy that could be dated to the revolutionary terror. François Furey's book famous book on thinking the French Revolution, in the English, this is one of the points that I like to cite, in the English edition, all of the critiques of transparency were simply removed or were phrased differently so that this would not appear particularly startling. In the French edition, the critique of translucence or transparence is all too frontal, and it's not simply something that comes as an aside. Here, in the translation, they become vague things about openness and what is good openness or bad openness. The other case that I like to cite is the book also concerning the ethical dimension of Jean Starobinsky's treatment of Rousseau, perhaps the most famous book with the term transparency in the title, where in the English-speaking world, once it was translated by Art Goldhammer, it was routinely reviewed, for example, by Robert Darnton or Judith Schlar, as the book that demonstrated most clearly what Rousseau meant about transparency. But the interesting thing about that book is not that it thinks that Rousseau's transparency is a good thing, but that it uses this in an almost diagnostic manner in the second half of the book to say the reason that the reason that Rousseau was quite this paranoid was entirely his commitment to his own transparency, so that the more that he became transparent to himself, the more all these shadows arose around him, so that it becomes a kind of logical paranoia, and Starobinsky doesn't actually have any doubt, express any doubt about actually diagnosing someone. I have a couple more minutes, I think, at most. I don't, at most. So to go back into the broader thought, what was the goal of this? If in the 1970s the goal was a critique of totalitarian ideas or of a critique of the state, in the 1960s it was also a conception of complexity, which was very much opposed either to epistemological or ethical reductionisms, and which was devoted to finding all these sort of nooks and crannies in which different priorities or counter-arguments to an overarching argument would be found. So if on the one hand we can call this a kind of end of humanism or an overcoming of Enlightenment ideals, it was also an elaborate commitment to positions that any overarching theoretical framework could not offer the full answer or tell the whole story. Think, for example, of Derrida's différence with an A, whereby all of these multiplications of possible positions of difference would be radicalized. Other figures would make much the same. There are various methodological points that, as I'm already over my time, I'm going to skip over. But very much of the idea was that I got gradually very excited about trying to write not about the individual thinkers that were in this picture, but about what happens to ideas that we don't really think very much about, or that we take for granted as we speak them, to things that we say, and then 30 years later you might point back to them and say, oh wow, look, all of this seemingly innocuous or minor term can actually open up a world to describing this. And this is interesting to me in part because I thought that one would be able to tell counter-histories to the history that I was offering as well. So this is not intended as an overarching history of what happens in Postwar France, much as I tried to describe it. Part of this was also intentionally a history of the present, if at the time critique of this obsession with transparency. I remember on one day on my Facebook feed appeared something that said, transparency is not just a human right, it is a revolution. And I never saved that, and I've always wondered what the hell that was supposed to mean, and how I managed to do quite that many magical things at the same time. But we could say that there's been an interesting shift precisely because of the Trump situation. That is to say that very much of the squirming and opposition that Trump's candidacy and presidency caused goes back to his complete mockery of basic expectations of open government and transparent government. All of the stories around, never divulge tax returns, undisclosed meetings, flamboyant family corruption, the appointment of satraps to positions of responsibility, those are, or positions of expertise, those are one side. But perhaps one thing that's most interesting about Trump is that he's managed to come up with a newer scenario advocating transparency, and that has everything to do with his Twitter feed, all the way to Kofefi. Because what the Twitter feed does is that it demonstrates, or it presents him in this pretense of completely unmediated behavior, whereby he can write as though he's granting his followers or his supporters the untethered, unveiled essence of his mind. And so the same scenario where he will say various violent things or taboo things and then will take them back and then re-express them. For example, around Charlottesville last year, where he was told that he eventually couldn't continue saying that this was, the poor white people that were, also, what did he say?
Very fine people.
The very fine people, thank you, that's what I was looking for. But then eventually, having disavowed the original position, went back to speaking in support of these very fine people. All this sort of overflowing id that campaign event. It seemed to me that this was just another replay of other parts of what we negotiate around the transparency ideal on a fairly regular basis. And part of the question that came up, and I don't mean this to be something that says, no, let's go to corrupt government, obviously, but to something that would speak of both complexity and a different kind of expectation of what a government is supposed to do, I suppose, in terms of what, how it's supposed to think of policy or what, complexity and not immediate, explainability, I suppose. Positions that cannot be explained within 5 seconds is lost in this call for transparency. That's always easier because it's always easy to say, I'm transparent and you're not. And much of the election of last year played out in scenarios of who's more transparent than the other. This question of how we go about negotiating positions around transparent government and a government that can have some sort of effect is part of what was on my mind. There's the last little thought, which is that about 10 days ago, and you'll see the parody of this, Paul Ryan said after the Republicans released the FBI memo that, quote, transparency can now reign supreme, which is, either you can close that thought with the recognition that this has become a completely meaningless word, or it's precisely the kind of thing that suits everybody to appeal to, and yet leaves all the problems that were left there, that were begun there at the same time. Those are not quite the ideals of the Postwar French situation, but that kind of engagement was something that I thought would be fun to continue with. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Transparency has come to be celebrated in the contemporary political landscape, as we have just heard. It's defended as the pillar of democratic governance, the foundation of public accountability, and an essential element of the citizen's right to know. Stefanos Kyrillanos' terrific book, Transparency in Postwar France, A Critical History of the Present, urges us to think critically about this contemporary fascination with transparency, and it does that by offering perceptive engagements with a wide range of French intellectuals who criticized transparency in the post-war era. Between 1945 and 1980, a period characterized by a growing chasm between state and society in France, transparency came to stand for state overreach and societal normalization. For thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jacques Lacan, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, Transparency was far from the ideal embraced in the name of democratic openness. Instead, it was a masterful, to use Stephanos' term, that signified a diverse set of philosophical, political, and ethical problems. Among the many targets of various criticisms dismantling transparency, we could list, for example, the ethical paradigm of a self that is transparent, unified, and identical, the positivist illusion of an unimpeded encounter between the mind and the world, the romantic desire to achieve immediacy and authenticity in interpersonal relations, a colonizing humanist gaze that assimilates the other into the self, and the totalitarian fantasy of a society that is transparent to its members and the state. This wide-ranging critique of transparency goes hand in hand with a re-evaluation and affirmation of opacity, ambiguity, uncertainty, alterity, difference, hybridity, and heterogeneity during this period. One of the key goals of the book is, quote, to unleash a series of questions relating to the contemporary fantasy of transparency from a historical and philosophical perspective, unquote. And I would like to raise some questions to invite Stephanos to discuss with us the political and normative states of his critical history of the present. To do that, I would like to start by outlining some of the dissimilar and at times conflicting invocations of transparency by the diverse range of thinkers examined in this book. I think this raises the question of whether some of these criticisms of transparency are more helpful than others when it comes to confronting and challenging the contemporary fantasy of transparency. Perhaps it's useful at this point to recall one of the key methodological points that Stephanos introduces at the outset. He is interested in a semiotic history that brings forth the numerous uses of transparency as a master tool, and he uses the illuminating metaphor of a web of strings to describe the embeddedness of concepts in social life and thought. Let me quote from the book, and I'll be skipping a sentence or two given time constraints. Quote, imagine a web made of strings. At each point where two or more strings intersect, they are tied together into a knot. As they extend between different knots, strings sometimes get tangled. Many strings allow some leeway. You could pull a string or a knot and watch other strings tighten or move. You could effect a different threading or even break a part of the web. Unquote. I'm interested in those knots in which there is such a strong tension between different strings that we see the breaking or rupturing of a part of the web, especially when what starts as a critique of transparency paradoxically gives rise to a new dream of transparency. Perhaps the most obvious example is Lévi-Strauss, whose critique of racism vehemently attacks the homogenizing and colonizing tendencies of traditional humanism that aims at intercultural transparency. But as Stephanos underlines, Lévi-Strauss's powerful renunciation of transparency does not stop him from imagining a counter-model or counter-utopia in which the anthropologist could relate to the indigenous others on the basis of a purportedly primitive empathy with forms of life. In other words, transparency resurfaces as a mythical ideal in Lévi-Strauss, who takes his inspiration, not surprisingly, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the very philosopher criticized by many thinkers of the time, including Jean Sterlinsky and Jacques Derrida, for this ideal of a self-present, transparent society freed from the distortions of representation. But Lévi-Strauss is not the only one to fall back upon this Rousseauian dream, and transparency seems to resurface precisely when and where it seems to be banished, to follow Derrida's crucial insight. Take, for example, Guy Debord, whose critique alerts us to the mystifying power of spectacles mediating every social relationship under capitalism. But what arises from that critique is a utopian yearning for a truly transparent, non-capitalist society that is free from spectacular representation. Not unlike Rousseau, who criticized the corrupting effects of theatrical representation and argued instead for public festivals that would vitalize patriotic sentiments, Debord dreams of an exuberant festival that could redeem individuals from the alienating effects of distorted representation under spectacular capitalism. Similar Rousseauian yearnings for transparency can also be detected in the work of Pierre Clastres, whose critique of the state as a mechanism of political alienation appears to be in line with various other critics who associate transparency with the state's desire to render society accessible to control and planning. But as different from Michel Foucault's anti-statist position, for example, Clastres' critique ends up affirming another dream of transparency. We see this dream in his quest for archaic societies without state mechanisms, where he identifies not only non-hierarchical social arrangements, but also the possibilities of a language that is pure speech, one that is presumably not tainted by power relations. The examples of Lévi-Strauss, Debord, and Clastres bring to view a very problematic mood in certain strands of transparency critique. To adopt Derrida's formulation of the problem in Of Grammatology, the anarchistic and libertarian protestations against law, the powers, and the state can harbor within themselves the old Rousseauistic dream of a community that is transparent, self-present, and free from distortions of representation or mediation. At several points in the book, Stephanos notes this problematic tendency in certain strands of transparency critique. But perhaps because his goal is to offer a conceptual history, he is more interested in the kinds of conversations and debates these Rousseauistic postures give rise to. He presents Derrida's critique of Lévi-Strauss, for example, but he does not explicitly state where he stands in this debate on transparency. Perhaps what I'm going to ask now requires him to step out of his role as an intellectual historian. But here is my question. Given the different strains in this conceptual web that you meticulously analyze, which criticisms of transparency seem more promising for confronting some of the contemporary problems? In raising this question, I think I'm not diverging from the goals of the book radically, especially from its goal of offering a critical history of the present, which emphasizes that, quote, the solutions pursued by French post-war thinkers in their rejection of transparency merit renewed attention today, unquote. I'd like to hear from Stephanos which of these solutions or positions can help us navigate the paradoxes of our contemporary landscape, which continuously oscillates between idealizations of transparent administration on the one hand and justifications of governmental secrecy on the other, or between advocacy of free circulation of information and concerns about individual privacy and exposure. The very end of the book, where Stephanos delves into some of these contemporary problems, seems to offer some hints here, as it suggests that perhaps now, more than ever, we need to revisit the work of Jean-François Lyotard, whose critique of the ideology of communicational transparency provides insights into the new hierarchical power relations created and justified by neoliberal economies of information and knowledge. Agreeing with Lyotard, Stephanos argues for, quote, a persistent, if nomadic, resistance against totality, homogenization, normalization. I'd like to hear more about this resistance, this mobilization of difference, as Stephanos puts it, using Lyotard's term for irresolvable disputes arising from the multiplicity and irreconcilability of language games. What does this resistance entail in more concrete terms? And for the purpose of elaborating on the political and normative states of this conceptual history, could you also say more about how the critique of transparency can serve as a différent in Lyotard's sense and participate in the work of what you call, quote, committed resistance to the spectacles of power, unquote. And finally, I'd also like to hear more about this resistance, especially in relation to a contemporary problem briefly mentioned at the end, but you just mentioned Trump problem. Namely, the abandonment of the dream of governmental openness, unquote, especially with the rise of new authoritarianisms. The conceptual history offered in this book seems to suggest that it would be futile, if not actually dangerous, to invoke transparency to oppose this contemporary phenomenon. However, given its multiple, diverse, and conflicting uses, transparency is also entangled with some ideas and practices that may be more difficult to let go, especially now. Take, for example, the modern political ideal of making political power accountable. we suggest that the government should in principle be subject to the judgment and repeal by the people. What happens to this ideal of public accountability in a resistance centered around dismantling of transparency? Is that ideal also abandoned because it's irredeemably tainted due to its association with the fantasy of transparency? Or is it possible for it to find new lives, potentials, and idioms in the service of the resistance that you described at the end? By way of a conclusion, let me reiterate once again what an excellent book this is. It's an exemplary work of intellectual history, offering a painstaking examination of the concept of transparency by zooming in on an historical context that radically challenges contemporary assumptions about that concept, and by providing readers with many crucial resources for thinking critically about transparency today. And for all that and more, this is a book that deserves to be widely read, commended, and discussed. Thank you.
Okay, so my comments are going to be a little bit more unstructured because I'm going to try to shape them a little bit around what was previously said. In the spirit of the book, they're going to be rhizomatic rather than linear. Hopefully they will be no less transparent nonetheless. In this book, Stefanos Geronos really asks us to, invites us to defamiliarize, to historicize and defamiliarize our current infatuation with transparency. In the process, question its emancipatory potential, which you alluded to very clearly right at the end. Very pressing question today. He brings us back to a time of suspicion, a time of suspicion about transparency and about the fantasies that it produced. We therefore learn a lot about the fantasies of the transparent self, the ethical self, the crystal clear whole human being, fantasies about the transparent world and about our knowledge of the world, whether it's positivist, whether it's idealist, whether it replicates a form of unmediated representation of the external world. And finally, the fantasy, perhaps the nightmare of a society that is transparent to the state, a sort of Orwellian totalitarian nightmare. Stefanos starts by inviting us to consider a deep historical grounding of this time of suspicion, going back to the predicament of the Enlightenment, the sort of dialectic of the Enlightenment, as he puts it, that is really grounded in the work of Rousseau, embodied in Rousseau. Transparency actually masks, it actually veils contradictions, diversity, all forms of sort of unruliness, therefore turning into a form of heteronomy that presents itself as a form of liberation. This predicament comes particularly to the fore in post-revolutionary France, and one of the questions, therefore, is why France, and I think it's something that we'll have to talk a little bit about. But before getting there, what I really want to say is just how amazing and wide-ranging panoramic overview of the forms and domains of this suspicion we get in this book. This is really a roller coaster ride that goes from existentialism, phenomenology, to epistemology and the history of science, from anthropology to sociology, to psychoanalysis, to psychiatry, asking questions about colonialism, questions about the alienation of the self and norms, and from political and social theory all the way to deconstruction and post-structuralism, where we really get into the question that I think is one of the most pressing ones for you, of how does this Orwellian state, this sort of seeing like a state, mask and try to subdue forms of resistance in daily life. This overview, this panoramic overview, is dazzling, to say the least. At times it is dizzying. I will say that too. There are in-depth readings of 20th century French thinkers that I found particularly illuminating, and the ones that spring to mind are really Lévi-Strauss, of course, Canguilhem, Lacan, and Foucault, who I was very happy to see was a latecomer to the discussion of norms, like that little quote. It is also dizzying in part because it is structured in a non-linear fashion, and here I'm borrowing your own words, and it adopts this rhizomatic structure, where transparency is a master code, as was mentioned previously, a phantom concept that spins and weaves this kind of, sort of fits into this web of strings and knots where intellectuals are puppeteers. I think that's the way you put it. I sometimes wondered if the intellectuals were not the puppets and you were the puppeteer pulling the strings and creating these webs. But that's something to discuss, to talk a little bit about, I think, as a sort of methodology for Begriffsgeschichte, for concept history, because it's obviously one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, at least to me as a historian and maybe a sort of Sunday afternoon intellectual historian. The payoff of all this is really a very oblique, unfamiliar, defamiliarizing panorama of French intellectual life post-World War II. Very vibrant intellectual life, and I think that is an important point to stress. That sort of goes against the idea of a sort of ossified structuralism. Here we get a sense of the vibrancy of the debates going on, and one that brings to light the sort of oblique networks of intellectual lineage, of affiliation, that are both synchronic and diachronic. And what I mean by that is that we Stephanos really doesn't fall into the trap of lumping together thinkers according to the stereotypical categories that they're typically affiliated to. And so here we get the sort of the structure versus post-structural division that is basically exploded, or that is not taken for granted. Left and right no longer really matters here. We're dealing with thinkers on both sides of the equation. Catholicism and secularism, you really cut across these divisions in a very provocative way. And likewise, temporally, we assess, we appreciate, we get a much better sense of the influence over time, of the breaks over time, and also of the returns, the return to Freud, the return to Rousseau, and how all of these fit together. So this is all incredibly impressive and incredibly rich for me to read. The questions that I have are, really follow from this and pertain, the questions that I'll ask are really pertain to the methodology of conceptual history and what you're actually sort of bringing to that as an addition to this Koselleckian moment that I think we can certainly all identify. And the first one is really about the question of social context. You have this phrase in the introduction, I believe, that you're trying to do a non-causal but continually but reorganized relationship. You're trying to trace a non-causal but continually reorganized relationship between concepts and history. So there's obviously an attempt to embed, to a certain extent, what's going on in some form of social contextualization. It wasn't always clear to me how far you were willing to push with that, other than by noting a certain number of key moments in sort of epiphenomenons almost in the history of post-war France. And so we have obviously the World War II and Vichy are very important. 1968, the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in France in the mid-70s, and the echo that it had in the 80s. And then the transitional moment at the end of the early 1980s, and the Mitterrand era and the turn in his presidency. And hanging in the background to all of this is the French Revolution, that is a sort of constant return of the repressed, really, there. But so, and obviously we're going through a phase of decolonization, there's debates about UNESCO. So there's some events, but other than that, I didn't get enough, to my liking, of a sense of how these debates are anchored in larger structural transformations. You sort of pass fairly quickly, I would say, over the transition from state capitalism to liberal forms of capitalism, and so I would love to hear a bit more about that. Is that part of the story, or is it just not something that really factors in? This, I think, would lead to a second question about why France, what is so specific about France. And so you make the claim that these events are partly to the things that explain why this debate about so this suspicion of transparency is so pronounced in France as opposed to elsewhere. But I kept asking myself, why not Germany too? The problem of an Orwellian state would be very present in Germany. after the Second World War. There are parallels that you trace in various moments with the kind of trajectory of the Frankfurt School is going through at this moment in time. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that. Is it just ultimately a question of different intellectual agendas, different traditions? Habermas crops up at the end as a sort of Kantian defense of transparency. Is it reducible to just different intellectual traditions in the two countries, or is there something else at play here? And finally, I guess the bigger question that I kept having, and it's sort of churlish in a book that is 400 pages long and so rich and has so many actors and figures and debates and questions in it, it's almost pointless to sort of ask for more. But you do mention at the beginning that you're not going to talk much about decolonization and about gender. I think in the first case you're a bit unfair on yourself because decolonization is there spectrally in the sort of critique of colonialism with Elise and the Lévi-Strauss and how that feeds into, it's very much part of the story, it felt very much part of the story to me, at least to a certain extent. Gender on the other hand is completely absent, or pretty much absent. And the only reason, the main reason why I bring it up is that I was trying to sort of, I don't want to sort of speak for Jen Scott here, but I was trying to sort of wonder what she might say. And I was thinking that it might be possible to say that it's actually a counter-narrative to your argument, that the transparency of the universal male, sort of the universal citizen in France, by default necessarily male, is a discourse that remains from the French Revolution all the way up to today, and sort of traverses through this period without getting questioned as a form of suspect form of transparency. At least in the sort of the French way of doing gender studies as it is canonically sort of presented. So, and this is very much a question of marginalization, very much a question of transparency leading to marginalization. So, is this the case? Am I completely wrong? I'd love to hear more about that. Obviously, it's not something that I necessarily think you should add another 150 pages to the second edition book, but I think it's worth talking about now. So thank you very much.
Stephanos, you have a choice. You can respond to any burning kind of comments or provocations now, or we can open it up immediately and take questions.
Let me try to do a little bit about the method part of this. And you'll see how this fits back into the question about gender, which is a question I was running as a problem all the more so as I was getting closer to finishing. And this goes to Aitan's approach to the web of strings. And this goes to Aitan's approach to the web of strings. So conventionally, by convention, the way intellectual historians are supposed to work is that you're supposed to have an idea or a couple of ideas, and then you have, human agents, institutions, discourses, contexts, and so on. And I find that to be a very flat and insufficient way of doing things, in part because no actor who uses words, or no thinker or speaker who uses words negotiates words as though they need to sort of reconstruct this entire form, and nobody else who uses them in an unmediated fashion in which they're not largely determined outside of their control. So part of the idea around this web of strings in which there are all these knots that are, each of them would denote a concept, so to speak. Around that idea was a way of saying, I'd actually like to do this not without context, not as though these concepts are up in the clouds, but as though they were clothes. And, I guess I'm going to stick to the metaphor now that I said it, as though they're the clothes with which people engage one another in these traditions of philosophical, anthropological, intellectual writing. Why is that significant? The first version was that I found that one cannot quite, writing this story, I felt that one couldn't quite tell when any sort of event had any sort of effect on the discussion of transparency. That's actually what made it so cool. that is to say that even with May 68, I had to work very hard to figure out how to negotiate that. I found that infinitely harder how concepts and words and their uses rub against, the skin of events or the space of engagements, of political engagements or of broader circumstances. And I thought that the benefit of avoiding a concept-based approach, a context-based approach, was that it would be possible to speak not of concepts as somehow, there in broader contexts and the story would be about the context. But rather I could talk about the concepts themselves in a manner that tried to give more than enough social and cultural context, but where the concepts would stand for that kind of context as well. Not simply as a kind of this internalist, externalist reading or social history of ideas or, a sense of what is the closer reading, but where reading closely would grant away, because this concept is sort of en passant, where the concept would grant a way of talking about it a little bit. I know that this is a little, I know that I cannot make a full, clear, methodological argument as to how exactly I think that this works. But my sense was that if I had a webbing of several of them, then I could watch how those move back and forth, and how indeed they take positions that various of the actors take positions that seem entirely counterintuitive, and where they said, look, there is no, the Duvall case, there is no possible transparent relationship under the sun. After the revolution, there will be. And you sort of think, well, that's kind of late, and you know better than that. You've made enough fun of this entire time. But it seemed to me that those kinds of debates came up because it wasn't about the word, it was about all the other uses of the words and all the other terms that this would come in relation to. I tend to ask before about when do knots get really tight, so to speak, or when do they break. And I thought of, gender was the one case where I really couldn't make it work. And I just simply think that this story doesn't work with gender in any consistent manner that I would find satisfactory. That is to say, it's possible for me to give a story that would say, look at Beauvoir, and look at the later discussions in her text, both of the married woman and of the construction of a gender imbalance in that text. Look at Christelle, or look at Chantal Ackermann, for example, in Je tue l'elle and elsewhere. And there I simply thought that if there's something that I have to give up on, this is part of it. This is what sets up the counter-narrative in this. One couldn't tell the entire story of something through a single concept in this, nor through that concept of it. But one could tell a good chunk of it that would then have to engage with other chunks of it. And feminism was one case where I thought that the agonistics there were very different. I thought the same about Fanon and some other figures in post-colonial thinking. In a way, the undoing of transparency in the post-war period is much more about white men rethinking their premises and not quite getting to a different shore. And that was the part about fantasizing. They fantasize a different shore, and over they just say, this hasn't gone anywhere. And that was something that I thought was actually worth talking about in that scenario. So that's so much about the social context version, and so much about saying that in some cases one gives up. And there are other examples, I think, where I would say that this just didn't feel like it worked. I was just trying to say I would want to have the tag that I didn't write about matters of gender. And yet, the more that I went through, the less that it sort of worked. It didn't connect. It seemed to me that that part, so to speak, was indeed a counter-narrative, that one would have to engage matters of French feminism in a very different approach than the approach that these figures were setting up. Despite how much many of them were concerned with norms, social, political, philosophical, and so on. So that would be one version, and that I can come back to the wife hands. But this also speaks to the question of a Begriffsgeschichte, that one doesn't simply speak of symmetric or asymmetric counter-concepts. One doesn't establish horizons of expectation and spaces of experience where concepts do go back to the Casella sort of framework. And one doesn't use these big Koselleck uses these Grundbegriffe, and for the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe project, there are all these huge ideas that are, state, sovereignty, theism, religion. And it seems to me that all the work is not done, the work is not being done there, the work is being done somewhere else. And these concepts are going to need to be rethought by way of work done in these. And then, where would I stand? So at the end of the book, I thought that I would play it slightly safe on the where would I stand, and I thought genuinely that yes, Jean-François Lyotard does present a case that's been very badly read in this country, partly because he was brought in through the sort of Frederick Jameson pushed idea of what postmodernism is. And when I reread the postmodern condition for this book, it seemed to me to be all about the rise of an early form of neoliberalism. That it seemed to me an extremely depressed book by comparison to this, or extremely skeptical book by comparison to this, happy postmodernism for children, we're moving to a new space. It was none of that. It was a scenario of look, we just cannot operate in the same manner. And watch all these figures, like the Derridas and the Foucaults and the Sartres, who thought even a decade ago that something's going to change as at the end of the order of things with the face of man at the edge of the sea. But it did change, and knowledge did get transformed. But it got transformed precisely by the impersonal, inhuman, or impersonal, non-human scenarios of these new economic networks. And his appeal at that moment to say, I'd like to find a little shade and I'd like to find a little difference in this case, points in which these arguments cannot hide. And I'd like to set up an agonistics from that perspective. That was something that was much more appealing to me, even though I wasn't entirely sure. I would also just say that flatly, the effect of committing to a web of strings scenario is also to say that yes, one cannot simply transpose from one to the other. And I feel bad saying this, but it's more about setting up criteria, I suppose, than saying here's a political program that can actually say things. Because you can say, yes, you do want government to be accountable, but at the same time you can be anxious about exposure, or you can be anxious about, somebody going on Twitter and saying, my government is the most accountable that it has ever been. Which Trump was by no means the first to claim. And so that these become scenarios that have far less to do with either what government's supposed to do or with democratic expectations, whereby transparency becomes a way of disavowal rather than something else of one's own responsibility. I think those will be the two that I take to start with. Though your questions give so much more material that I'm hoping I can steal away from other questions.
Questions from the audience?
I have a question. Going back to what Thomas was asking, I think the tough question was not about context and text, was more about the web, and was also agents. It seems to me part of the question was about the criteria. You mentioned criteria at the end of your response here for the constitution of the web, for the identification of the nodes, and what kind of thread you pull. One of the things that struck me that you mentioned at the end, transparency in contemporary American politics, where it's a very kind of, first of all, it's used in a positive way. We are transparent. While all the guys you mentioned seem to actually look at the obstacles to transparency, right? The opacity, the complexity, and so that is there a positive concept of transparency? Do people use the word transparency? It seems to me that, for example, a notable point of view is Stravinsky, La Transparence et l'Obstacle, right?
Yes.
The rereading of also bringing together the ethical and the political and the obstacles to transparency. It seems to me that I haven't read the book, but it seems to be a very strong, important kind of departure for your illustration. Also doesn't, as far as I remember, you see there's an enormous Rousseauian corpus, doesn't use the word transparent, right? And so, or not often, this is not a central concept, right? So my question has to do with those tensions, which are obviously obvious when you think about Lévi-Strauss as both someone who affirms interest a topic that you cannot really identify, I suppose, or with the native, and at the same time the whole point of structuralism is to put on a table all the structural determinants of the commonalities in structures of thought and social structures, right? So I'm wondering, and that's maybe the non-charitable but provocative reading of what you're doing, but I try to understand it a little better because, why would we think transparency means the same thing when, in a discourse by Barack Obama on a Trump tweet, and Rousseau's, speaking about the social contract or something like that. So and going back to Lévi-Strauss, there can be the suspicion that the kind of tension between, let's say, ethical vision of transparency and the cognitive or epistemological vision of transparency is something that comes from your being the puppeteer, right? It's not something that together. So can you tell us more? It's all about how you span your web, that the obligation is to spin in the past.
Yes.
You span your web.
So,
thank you.
So the term from the Confessions is something like "Mon cœur transparent comme cristal," my heart transparent as crystal, which is the one that Sartre uses over and over. It's not that there aren't any positive uses of transparency. It's that there are so few of them, and they're so usually very specifically politically motivated. That is to say, it's a sort of hardcore communist plus, again, after the proper revolution, things are going to get better. After, or in Catholicism, in which transparency in personalism, for example, is meant to refer to pre-Renaissance transparency inflicted and made possible by communion and confession in front of a kind of medieval imagined priest, whereby the connection to God was straightforward. Now this does come back. But how did I spin the web? I think that I started with 4 or 5 reference points in mind. The first one was exactly this. Once I started looking at it, the most obvious case is the epistemological one. La transparence et l'obstacle. L'obstacle is a Bacheladian term, and it's very much intended in that form. And Bachelard does speak of transparency and its failures, or of this kind of crossing the pretense of having crossed every kind of obstacle into understanding the world as it supposedly is. And then the obstacle, of course, arising anew in that, because that, you can't sort of break through that veil, so to speak. And in parallel to that, it was similarly the case with anthropologists of the 30s like Rion, who are the much more sort of comfortable with colonialism, let's say. It's a different case than Sustained, but nevertheless very comfortable with colonialism, and that's a polite way to put it. There too, the goal of, let's say, so in Rion, there's the manual, in which manual he very much says that the whole point is to make the native transparent, to make them talk as though that you're the examining magistrate. Then there's the other end of the story. So this is a couple of the starting points. And transparency appeared in Sartre in the first 50 pages, for example, of Being and Nothingness, where the entire point is to say this is about a phenomenology whereby the world is not transparent to consciousness. Where it couldn't be, that even the transcendental reduction of Husserl would not be operation sufficient. And at the other end, it was this mixture of circumstances of the 70s. And I sort of spun it moving from the two ends toward the center and to see where it came. So in the 70s, it was this sort of self-transparency of society and the thought. It was the panoptic imagination. It was the appearance of transparency in Lyotard, including in the postmodern condition. And I'm sort of forgetting what the other edges of this were.
But they get reconfigured.
But that they all get, yes, I mean, this, in a way, so it's as if I sort of identified this going from the edges to the center and then wrote it the other way around. So the concern was to say, I couldn't tell you a story about transparency itself that would be worth 30 pages. But I could tell you a story about all the concepts that it's linked to and transparency that is actually worth, 450 pages. It's as bad a joke for me. So, because then I could tell a story that would have to do with the conception of cinema, for example. I could tell a story that would have to do with the conception of gray zones within society as the government perceived them in the end of World War II, after the Liberation. I could then sort of go bit by bit. So the presence of the term transparency was key, but it was also key that it was frequently used en passant, that it wasn't thematized as much as Stravinsky does. And so that's why the book begins with Stravinsky, so as to sort of, not so much to front how important it is, but to kind of get rid of that part so I can talk about all these other concepts that where transparency is used and then they take over, like Canguilhem on the norm, for example, where the norm is supposed to be transparent, the normal is supposed to be transparent, and instead it should be a kind of living norm that is a counter-norm to the kind of statistical center that he deems as fascist. So that kind of thing came up. And so I'm willing to grant that in a way this isn't a practice of precision, exactly. It's a practice of precision in terms of the reading. But it's not a practice where I would say that you could easily just say, well, I just read this person and they said this, for example, but that would not be it. I have an additional little example. The day that the book actually arrived at home, of all people, Régis Debray gave this interview about Lacan in which he said, I don't understand all this. I wish I was looking for it before. He said, I don't understand all this sort of obsession with being transparent. When I was a child, no politician would have ever been designated as transparent. Only the orpheline of Les Miserables could ever be described. And this is a gesture, right? It's only the literary trope. Only as a literary trope is transparency a plus, because there it's a pure character. Only the Cosette could be transparent, and now the government is all obsessed about it. So I suppose that part of the reason this continues, or that I treated this as something continuing, is because I wanted to see in part what kind of value this post-structuralist paradigm would still have for the present, and what ways it related to democratic theory that didn't simply produce this kind of, oh, here you have this person, and there you have Foucault, and they don't like each other, therefore, solution. That's the kind of context-driven thing that I do. Sorry, that was long.
You mentioned the notion of the imaginaire, I think, twice in the book, and I'm wondering if that's something that helps you sort of have this looser sense of it's in the air, it's a sort of meta-phantom concept that is structured in different discourses, people are relating to it.
And I think that was one part, and the other side was more to say, I'm very warm to the approach in history of science of historical epistemology, of trying to figure out what the premises are for any kind of knowledge to be possible under certain circumstances. But I'm not so sure of how we do that outside of a world, organized around experiments or organized around certain kinds of reversals of knowledge, because here there isn't something like that. But I'd like to try that as an attempt. That was the one part. The imaginaire was one version of that. So that all of these other concepts could become kind of guiding machineries, I suppose, for the transparency program to be carried on, without that being always evident.
Thank you. A small caveat. I haven't read the book, but I found this sort of, conversation very generative. And I was wondering if you considered, sort of fundamental concepts of the Marxian tradition when it comes to the discussion of transparency, ideology, commodity fetishism, or even Gramsci's hegemony as basically this, the horizon of the commonsensical. And part of my motivation to ask you this question is to follow on Aiden's sort of comment in which I heard that in Debab, for example, the critique of transparency could be sort of related to a question of alienation that's overcome later on, for example. Or one can think about Freudian psychoanalysis in that sense of sort of making when you make what's unconscious conscious in that way, there is less of an opaque relationship of the self to the self. And my other motivation as well is to sort of go back to Thomas' question about if we think about this question as related to critical traditions and not necessarily a national context, how much is this a French story, or how much is this a story of critical traditions that are not necessarily national stories? And my last minor comment, you started with Obama and this whole sort of liberal celebration of transparency, but we also live in times where whistleblowers are put in prison. Whistleblowers, WikiLeaks. So the question of basically, a sort of ideological discourse celebrating transparency, but also a sort of modern nation state which is very, very, that cracks down on any sort of basically, leakage when it comes to information that are related to its transparent operations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first part regarding the Marxist tradition and Gramsci. I didn't use Gramsci because he doesn't ever appear in these discussions. So there was something about where things become proximate, or they seem to be close enough as arguments. I don't think that is very far, but I thought that the moment that I allow other people to come in, then all sorts of other discussions come in that I would not necessarily be able to control at all. That is not to say that there isn't a discussion of Marxian thought in the book. They come and go. There's a discussion about Toussaint that I'm fairly fond of, insofar as that Toussaint specifically says transparency is an exemplary case of ideology. And so that scenario was just, thank you. I'm so happy that this made it easier. So, after a point you kind of look for, you kind of hope that somebody will make your day a bit easier and have you to actually say it explicitly. So, that was the
first time Althusser's made it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, he's so explicit about it, it's actually kind of fantastic. And about Debord, I agree that Debord is a peculiar case in this. In the one hand, he's kind of a very traditional Marxist who's managed to do this sort of Lukács Gramsci and then position himself. On the other hand, it is so, I guess I've become unsympathetic over time in this. I find the part of Debord's thinking that's more interesting to be the part that folded back into theory film, and that had to do with an understanding of the spectacularity of film. But I suppose that I don't have that much to say other than that. He is presented, he makes a remarkable critique of the spectacle as false transparency, explicitly as false transparency. And then the dream of the festival is a kind of late-come scenario. On Freud, yes, this voice of Solidarity is true, and Lacan does say that, but Lacan also makes it extraordinarily difficult to have a way of actually confirming. That is to say, both through the imaginary and then through the symbolic. The imaginary and the relationship to oneself across the mirror stage is an orthopedic relationship of constructing a self. And then the symbolic as something that strictly is separate from the language that I speak now as a conscious subject. In both of those cases, there are enough walls, so to speak, that one doesn't quite get there. It remains an ethical ideal, but it seems almost compelling and significant. I hope that the last bit that I'm blanking on, maybe because whistleblowers. There's a part of me that thinks,
if you think about Chelsea Manning and the whole public debate about that question of treason.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. I simply don't have something significant to add to it, because in one way it seems all the more obvious, right? The reason that one reason why one would celebrate transparency is precisely in order to cover things up. It's not very hard to imagine this. That's why people would present it so visibly. Or in order not to have to put another ideal in its place. And so the Manning case is remarkable because of how literal it is, I suppose, in that form. So nobody's going to say, well, as a matter of fact, well, I guess a Obama did at the end of his tenure, but nobody said easily that a logic of state was going to give up on privileges of state. In the French case, I found it interesting that this was a very insisted or almost naturalized kind of language. That a logic of state is a logic of state, and this is not something that you're going to make much better. It's not something that you need to be afraid of in that scenario. So you're not going to pretend that a state is. Only a fool who's leading, or only a liar would ever say that my state is transparent, or my government is transparent. I sort of wanted at some point, if possible, to say something about this Leroi-Gourhan France thing, but otherwise I think that's what I'm basically saying.
We have time for one last question. Great, I'll ask a question, if I may. No one jumped out. So, in my area of research in the European Union, transparency it's an instance in which transparency is a particularly prominent buzzword. And while the European Union, its operations are by no means sort of fully transparent, I think that they do make a sincere effort. It's not in the sort of, Paul Ryan, completely facetious sense, but they do really try. And my suspicion is that they really try, because transparency has sort of come to be this consolation prize for the fact that we've given up on democracy, right? Because we can't have this, ideal of ruling and being ruled in turn. We can't have, robust mechanisms of accountability and responsiveness from our political leaders, because basically late capitalism has forced us into this extensive technocratic discipline that we might as well be ruled by a transparent technocracy.
Yes, and I think that's exactly so. I think that's exactly the Obama scenario, right? There's a crisis going on. Let's forget about hope and change and get the consolation prize of transparency. So that would be one scenario. Another version is that I suspect that the European case is slightly different insofar as it has been that Europe has been maligned for so many decades as being this obscure mechanism and this obscure technocracy. To rewatch Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister is to watch Humphrey Appleby make fun of, European technocrats for being opaque to them. So somehow the politics of this and the hostility toward Europe has been responded. Transparency there has been a moderately, I suppose, effective approach of saying, no, there isn't really that much that's in hiding. Here's how you can see it. Only moderately. Again, I do not want to suggest that it's, a priori a bad thing. No concept and no term operates with that kind of value, with a kind of single value that's toggled on or off in that direction. But the other effect of the European Union is precisely the sort of continuing joke, so to speak, such that the Greeks, the Central and Eastern Europeans, the Germans, the British, the French, and the Spanish and Portuguese can all claim that they find Europe, for different reasons, extremely opaque to them, and that the entire dream of it, which was never actually originally a transparency dream, it was, for all the things that it was, it went in a rather different direction, seemed to be getting cornered there. I don't think that's, necessarily a good or bad thing. Or, again, this isn't about saying the government should not be accountable. It's perhaps to say that it should do something in this form. And that scenario about Europe failing to do something or to even market itself with that, I suppose the transparency is a particularly bad marketing tool once somebody starts actually looking back at the facade. Maybe. Again, maybe.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Gerlanos and Professors Gundod and Donman for a fantastic panel discussion.